Welcome back to the second session, and this session is really going to focus on some of the issues relating to quality and research design and evaluation data. So as before, each of our speakers will have about 20 minutes to speak, and then we'll have the time at the end for addressing questions to both speakers. So we're going to start with Dr. Rhys Andrews, who's Reader in Public Management at Cardiff Business School, who will be talking about evaluating regional variations in public service effectiveness using quantitative data. Thanks, Rhys.
Thank you. Good morning. My name, as we've already guessed, is Dr. Rhys Andrews. I work in Cardiff Business School in the Public Management Research Group there, which is led by the Dean of the Business School, Professor George Boyne. And George and a group of us have been working on the determinants of public service improvement for the past 15 or so years, and built up quite a kind of corpus, if you like, of work in that area, focusing both on the impact of management practices on the effectiveness of public organisations, and also on spatial variations in effectiveness, which is what I'm going to be kind of focusing on today in particular. So, as I'm sure everyone in the room is very well aware, the effectiveness of public services is a key topic for the past decade or so, and obviously will continue to be so in the future, although in a very different climate, of course. This has become a sort of self-perpetuating industry, if you like, to some extent within the field, with lots and lots of journal articles and lots of books dealing with theories of improvement, and also dealing with methods and evidence of improvement, not just obviously in the UK, but across the globe more generally. And we recently did a review of the top 5 public administration journals, and of course there is work on the effectiveness of public organisations in other social science areas. But in this review we found that there were over 100 papers that focused, that were empirical studies of public service improvement in various parts of the world. And one of the most striking things about this is that, of course, a large proportion of that, probably at least half, have been conducted in the UK, and that has become it has become a kind of research strength of the UK, and hopefully will continue to be so. Moving on to the topic for my presentation. Well, regional variations in public service effectiveness are important. Why? Well, because of course this has implications for territorial justice within states. And if you think about the UK, we have a multinational, a kind of state now with regional governments in both Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And the extent to which public service outcomes vary across those new devolved administrations has important implications for the kind of ways in which one might think about what it means to be a citizen of the UK in particular. And of course, devolution offers a very exciting natural laboratory for thinking about and studying the regional variations in effectiveness. For example, there are lots of debates in Wales in particular about the implications of variations in education spending and the implications for formula funding, such as the Barnett formula, which I won't deal with in any great detail, but I'm sure you're all familiar with these very, very high-level policy debates. In this presentation, I will just focus my attention on the ways in which one might think about designing a quantitative evaluation of variations in effectiveness across England, Scotland and Wales, but one might also think of doing so in other countries where there are regional governments in place, such as Spain, for example. In doing so, I'm not going to be focusing a lot of my attention, if any, on econometric estimation strategies, whether or not to use fixed effects, random effects, Ariano bond type estimators and so forth, which are obviously very important and interesting in their own right, but rather I'm going to be focusing very closely on issues of measurement and model specification. And part of the rationale for doing so is that, in a sense, the most important thing, particularly when one is hoping to communicate the findings of such studies to a policy audience and to a wider public, is that it's important to show that the kinds of models that you've been implementing and using are very clearly communicable and understandable. So why might one expect regional variations in public service effectiveness? Well, institutional theory tells us that governments and of all hues and of all types are regulative institutions. So following devolution, the establishment of regional governments sets up these very, very powerful bodies which have policy-making powers and which are able to therefore set the boundaries and give various types of steers to the public organisations for which they're responsible. One of the key ways in which regulative institutions might influence variations in effectiveness is therefore the extent to which the policy mood music, if you like, as much as the actual concrete policies might have an implication for the ways in which public organisations behave. So, for example, a kind of crude caricature, if you like, of the post-devolution policy divergence, which is kind of a familiar trope within the public administration literature, is that England has been subjected to this kind of marketised yet targets and terror type approach of public service policy, whereas Scotland has been focused much more on a kind of professionalised, if you like, a kind of corporatist model, and Wales has had this kind of very localised, what they like to describe as the sort of partnership model. And obviously these are categories which are to some extent not at all impermeable, but the caricature kind of remains and is a way of thinking for how regional variations might influence public service effectiveness. A further potential source of regional variations is the actual quality of those institutions themselves. So in the first instance, the extent to which institutions have the freedom to set their own policy agendas, and then secondly, in terms of that particular dimension of the institution, the power and authority they have with which to implement and change the behaviours of public organisations. In addition to that, of course, the actual sort of organisational capacity is also a very important issue in terms of determining the potential for policy to be made in a very effective and joined up, for example, manner, and the extent to which you've got the right people in place with the right skills and so forth. And a further potential source of regional variations therefore also is in terms of the budget allocation to different public services, the actual ways in which budgetary priorities are set and the amount of money available to be spent in driving public service improvement, both in terms of the actual spending, for example, on staff, which would be quite obviously a revenue expenditure, how well, for example, teachers might be remunerated, and also capital investment, so how much infrastructure development has there been within the region, how much money has been spent on building new schools, new hospitals, and so on. And how one might capture these kind of effects using quantitative data? Well, first of all, one might just adopt a fairly straightforward kind of way of measuring region, which is simply by coding for the region in which one's interested. So, for example, an intercept dummy might code for Wales or for Scotland, will code that variable 1 where it is Wales or Scotland, 0 for the other cases. Other ways in which one can explore those kind of very specific regional effects would be to create regional spending effect dummies. So, for example, there you actually include simply, you replace the coding of 1 and you introduce the spending level within a particular region. And there's a very good piece by George Boyne himself in 1991, I think it is, in Regional Studies, where he explores the regional effects of Welsh public spending. A very interesting and informative way of thinking about doing so. perhaps of more interest, certainly going forward into the future for my own particular research interests, are the extent to which one might think about modelling the allocation of spending to specific policies, so the extent to which what's known as intervention intensity in the literature is reflected in the amount of money spent on, for example, I don't know, in Wales, for example, we have the free bus passes, how much money is spent subsidising that in Wales, and the extent to which that has a relationship with, for example, an indicator of access to public transport or something like that. Other interesting potential measures for thinking about divergence between regions are indices of the authority autonomy of regional governments. There's a great piece in Regional and Federal Studies, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, by Marx, Huger and Scharkel, in which they introduce a measure of self-rule and shared rule to categorise regional governments across Europe. And it seems to me that there's certainly a lot of mileage in thinking about how to apply that to questions of regional variations in public service effectiveness, and someday I may look into some of that myself. Finally, there's straight up ratings of institutional capacity of the kind that are being abandoned in England at the moment, for example, comprehensive performance assessment of local governments, capability reviews in the UK civil service, and this kind of thing has also been occurring internationally, so you have things like the Government Performance Project in the US and quality of government studies carried out by Bo Rothstein and colleagues in Sweden. I was just going to kind of reiterate some of the points, I guess, that have been raised already, in particular by Erica, around how one measures public service effectiveness and what it means to measure public service effectiveness. And the first thing is to note is that typically it is interpreted to mean the attainment of key goals. Yet that, of course, can be interpreted in various different ways because different stakeholders have very different goals. So, for example, managers may be focused more on the extent to which cases are processed very quickly. Frontline staff may be interested in the extent to which clients are pleased with the service they've received. Politicians like targets. Citizens are more interested in how responsive the service may be to their demands. Taxpayers care about their money, in theory. Regulators are more interested, for example, in the kind of capacity measures that were mentioned earlier. In an ideal world of the evaluation heaven, if you like, it would be great to have measures of each of those stakeholders and to be able to compare those and introduce those within a balanced scorecard. And of course, in practice, evaluation heaven doesn't exist, so that kind of comparable data is generally not available across stakeholders, but at the same time, one can focus, or if you like, zone in on particular stakeholders and examine measures that are more relevant to those particular stakeholders. Again, we heard something about the types of measures that are available to examine public service effectiveness. So, for example, there's the administrative measures held archivally, performance indicators and that kind of thing, and then survey measures such as customer satisfaction, citizen perception measures, as well as you can obviously clearly survey managers about their performance, which is something that we've done a great deal of work on. One of the interesting things about that, of course, is that there's often a very weak correlation between these different types of measures, again posing certain sorts of problems for the pursuit of evaluation heaven, nirvana, or whatever you'd like to call it. More broadly, the kind of requirements that one would look for in the kinds of data that one wants to do these evaluations are, as we've already discussed, the kind of comparable definitions. Within the specific example of regional variations, those definitions across England, Scotland and Wales were very much more harmonised and homogenised, probably in about 2000. Now you'll find that even measures of apparently similar things have got very different definitions, as the different devolved administrations have pursued very different performance management agendas. Other ideal requirements are that the data have been independently audited, so the Audit Commission or other similar bodies have examined the quality of the data. And as we've already heard as well, these data should be longitudinal. One of the important things from our perspective as the public management group in the Cardiff Business School is that we tend to study organisational performance. So we're interested typically in attribution to organisations rather than thinking about individual level and kind of attribution to broad policies. Well, obviously there's some sort of slippage in between the two. Some of the data sets that we've drawn on to do some work in this particular area, I've just noted these up here. So for example, in England you have the ICNHS UK website, Stats Wales in Wales, and then obviously the Audit Commission still hold a lot of very valuable performance indicator data. In England in particular, it's been noticeable that a lot of data has been disappearing from government departmental websites. It is possible still though to find some of that data on the National Archives. What I'd like to do now is just discuss a study that I and a colleague, Steve Martin, conducted looking at regional variations across England, Scotland and Wales. This work emerged from the Beecham Review of Local Public Services in Wales, in which Steve in particular advised the Welsh Assembly on ways in which the small organisations responsible for public services in Wales might find ways of improving services without there being a massive restructuring and amalgamation of these smaller organisations. And this is a debate that is still ongoing in Wales, and there are various proposals still being mooted for strategies to either amalgamate or to avoid amalgamation. Speaking very basically about the ways in which we carved up the data to try and think about how one could model regional variations across these three areas. We focused on data availability for a variety of public organisations, and we did so by looking at the areas served by unitary local governments. So the basic unit of analysis, if you like, is the local government area. And in doing so, we looked at a range of different administrative data, so performance indicators in acute and primary healthcare, waiting times, immunisation rates, education, social services, so this is exam passes and access to home help, benefits, processing, recycling rates, crime rates, and so on and so forth. And within this study, we've adopted, if one were to have a hierarchy of ways of capturing regional effects, we sadly came out, if you like, at the bottom of that hierarchy. We just looked at simply coding dummy variables for Scotland and Wales and introducing those into a multivariate statistical model. And just to note that we did get the same results when we tapped in an England dummy instead of those dummies. And I just introduced the statistical model. We looked at the basic raw scores, the mean difference in means, and then obviously developed a multivariate model which was able to kind of try and capture the effects of region when controlling for other important influences. Now this kind of model is a very kind of standard and, for us now at least, a very basic production model that we've implemented in various circumstances and various settings, particularly local government, but also in health and also in other countries such as US state governments and various other places. I suppose the most important thing perhaps to notice there is the final measure that we included in the statistical model, which is the past performance measure. So this meant we had it was only a very short panel of 4 years of data, but by including the past performance measure we were able to track variations in the rate of improvement rather than just variations in performance per se. The findings, and I don't really want to talk about these too much, partly because they can be interpreted as being controversial, but also because the purpose is really just to think through the ways in which one might go about this and how to improve one's research designs. And what we found was that there were regional variations in the rates of improvement across England, Scotland and Wales. Some of these may be a little bit surprising. I think the take-home message, if you like, of the study is that services generally were improving, but there were variations in how fast that was occurring. So in particular, in Wales, there was a very strong effect emerged that hospital waiting times, for example, were very much on the sort of back burner compared to other parts of the UK. And this was something that was recognised in the press more widely in Wales and later resulted in a ministerial resignation and change and some improvement thereafter. Similarly, again speaking specifically to the Welsh case, there continue to be very, very serious debates about educational attainment in the wake of the PISA results. One of the ways in which Steve Martin and I sort of speculate about the results of the study are that the English case seems to have seen faster rates of improvement as a general rule, and that this is perhaps attributable to the kind of harder hitting performance management regime there, which was abandoned in particular in Wales, and which now in response to these, what must be 10 years or so of debates about declining performance, prompting the Education Secretary in Wales to reintroduce league tables and Key Stage 1 testing, which had been abandoned at that time. So, that was just a very brief introduction to one particular study. At the same time, that study is very, very limited in many ways, and it's basically impossible to form a kind of complete picture of what it means to observe regional variations in public service effectiveness, because data limitations are very severe in terms of the amount of indicators that are actually comparable. We found 21 only in 2001 to 2004. Now, looking at the same kinds of data sets, I'd be surprised if there were more than 10. At the same time, those indicators themselves are fairly limited. Some of them are fairly intuitive, so for example rates of recycling and exam passes. Some of them are very much more process orientated than outcome orientated, around, for example, the processing of benefits cases. So as the discourse has moved away from that more process orientation, from the place where it started, if you like, 10 years ago, towards a more outcome-based approach, it would be very nice if these kinds of more holistic types of measures of social outcomes were still available in the future. And as I've already mentioned, something around gauging the effects of institutional equality is a very important issue in terms of trying to disentangle what it is that makes regions have different levels of public service effectiveness. I've already noted the Marx et al. Index as one way of starting to think through some of that. And again, capital investment strategies have PFIs. PFIs have certainly led to a lot of money being spent in England, though of course that may cause problems further down the line, but has that had an influence on public service effectiveness? This is a question that it seems to me is absolutely key, particularly in England. And again, thinking about evaluation heaven, it would be lovely to have that 10-20 year performance indicator data set, but as I've already mentioned, that seems extremely unlikely. So just to draw some broad conclusions, drawing on the limitations of the studies that we've conducted in Cardiff and from our work more generally. Yeah, as I'm sure we're all aware, typically quantitative evaluations of effectiveness are always kind of indications of what may be occurring rather than a conclusive picture or story of what has happened on the ground. And that requires not only more sophisticated, if you like, at the scale of quantitative evaluations, randomised control trials and so forth, but case study work to try and explore and tease out what it is going on within these organisations that results in these different kinds of outcomes. And we've seen that policy divergence might be one explanation for public service effectiveness. In terms of the England-Wales educational attainment divergence, there's been further studies carried out by, for example, the Centre for Markets and Public Organisation in the University of Bristol, which points to variations in spending as the reason for these differences in attainment levels. There's also an interesting study carried out in Warwick that looks at the performance management regimes also, and sees that as a potential source of some of this variation. One of the other interesting things which I think will be discussed further in one of the later presentations is the extent to which local variations may be responsible for wider variations at a higher level, and multi-level regression models might be able to tease out the extent to which local organisations are doing things differently and are perhaps having wider implications for the region as a whole. Without wanting to sound too disheartened by the whole, if you like, the last 5 years of performance management post-devolution, unfortunately it will be more difficult to compare the outcomes across England, Scotland and Wales. One of the most disappointing things, if you like, about that from a public management research perspective is that the approaches to dealing with the budget cuts and the fiscal austerity across the UK are very different. It would have been very nice to have seen whether those different approaches resulted in different levels of service effectiveness, whether resilience was higher in those parts of the UK where a less, if you like, aggressive cutting procedure was being implemented.